The notary hadn't even finished reading the will when my stepbrother slammed his hand on the table so hard the water glasses shook. "This is a joke," he said, "not a question. A declaration." I was still wearing black. We all were. My father had been in the ground for 3 days. I barely slept since the hospital called. I hadn't eaten a real meal. My boyfriend Marcus had driven 4 hours from Ottawa to sit beside me at the funeral, and even he looked exhausted. The kind of tired that comes from holding someone together who keeps threatening to fall apart. I was that someone. And now I was sitting in a beige office in Mississauga, listening to a stranger read my father's final words, while my stepbrother Liam, a man I had known since I was 11 years old, looked at me like I had stolen something from him. I hadn't stolen anything, but he was about to try. My father, Gerald, was a practical man. He'd immigrated from Scotland in his 20s, built a small but profitable commercial plumbing supply company in the GTA, and spent 40 years being exactly the kind of person who showed up on time, paid his taxes, and never borrowed money he couldn't return. He loved Tim Hortons in the morning, hockey in the winter, and his vegetable garden in the summer. He was not a complicated man. He was also, for the last 6 years of his life, married to a woman named Vivienne. I want to be fair about Vivienne. I tried for a long time to be fair about Vivienne. She was charming when she wanted to be. She remembered birthdays. She made a genuinely excellent butter chicken. When my father first introduced her to me, I was 24, already living on my own in Toronto, and I thought, okay, he's lonely. Mom has been gone for 3 years. He deserves to be happy. What I didn't understand back then was the difference between a person who makes someone happy and a person who makes someone feel needed. Vivienne had a son, Liam. He was 2 years older than me, 33 to my 31, and from the moment my father and Vivienne got married, Liam had treated my father's house like a hotel he had permanent booking at. He never paid rent. He worked in sales in a way that never seemed to involve an actual employer or a T4 slip. He drove a leased BMW and somehow always had money for Leafs tickets, but never for groceries. My father paid for those groceries. My father paid for a lot of things I didn't find out about until much later. The notary, a patient woman named Miss Asanon, who had clearly sat through worse family moments than this, cleared her throat and continued reading. My father had left me the house. He had left me controlling interest in the company. He had left a modest sum to a cousin in Inverness. He had left Vivienne a structured payout, generous, I thought, given everything, but not the house, not the business. Nothing had been left to Liam. That was when Liam said it was a joke. "Dad, promise me," he said, looking at me. He still called my father Dad. Even now, he told me I'd be taken care of. "He did take care of you," I said, "for 6 years. The look he gave me. I still think about it sometimes. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder, like I had confirmed something he'd always suspected about me. Miss Arsenault suggested we take a few minutes. Vivienne hadn't said a word. She was sitting very still with her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at the window, not at me, not at Liam, not at Liam. I would think about that later too, the fact that she wasn't surprised. The first strange thing had happened 8 months before my father died. He called me on a Tuesday evening. My father never called on weekday evenings. He thought it was rude to interrupt people's dinners, and he sounded off. Not sick, exactly. Just thin, somehow, like there wasn't quite enough of him on the other end of the line. I asked him how he was. "Oh, fine," he said. "Tired, doctor says it's just my iron." He mentioned the doctor again 2 weeks later, then a third time. My father had never, in my entire life, mentioned a doctor voluntarily. He was the kind of man who referred to hospitals as places for people who had given up. I drove out to Mississauga on a Saturday in March. He looked older than I remembered from Christmas. He'd lost weight, though he waved that off. "Getting in shape," he said, and laughed in a way that didn't reach his eyes. His hand shook slightly when he poured tea. I noticed he didn't go out to the garden, even though it was a mild day and the snow had mostly melted. Liam was there. Liam was always there. He was watching something loud on the TV in the living room and didn't look up when I came in. I asked my father quietly in the kitchen whether he was really okay. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he said, "just getting old." I was 31 years old and I believed him. I have to live with that. He was admitted to Trillium Health in April. Cardiac irregularities, they said initially. His heart was doing something it shouldn't. He was pale and fatigued, and the doctors were running tests. Vivian called me to her credit. She called me right away, and I drove out that same evening. He looked small in the hospital bed. My father had always seemed large to me, even though he wasn't really average height, a little stocky, the kind of man who filled a room not with his size but with his steadiness. In that bed, under those lights, he just looked tired. I stayed for 4 hours. Liam showed up near the end, sat in the corner scrolling his phone, and left before I did. The doctor pulled me aside before I left. She was careful with her words, physicians always are, but she said something that lodged in my brain like a splinter. She said that his levels were consistent with prolonged exposure to something that was affecting his heart, and that they were running additional panels. She said it in a tone that was professionally neutral. I drove home on the 401, and I kept repeating the phrase in my head. Prolonged exposure. I called Marcus when I got home. He listened, the way Marcus always listened, completely, without jumping in, and then he said, "What does that mean, do you think? Prolonged exposure to what?" I didn't know. I told myself it could mean anything. Stress, environmental factors. He was 67 and had worked in construction supply his whole career. There were 100 explanations. I told myself that, but I didn't entirely believe it. My father's operations manager was a woman called Ruth. She had worked for him for 19 years. She was sharp, quiet, and deeply loyal, the kind of employee my father described as the person who actually runs the place, and he said it with genuine admiration. When I called her 2 days after the hospital visit, I told her I was checking in on behalf of my father while he recovered. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you called, actually. There's been something I've been wanting to talk to Gerald about, but with everything going on." She trailed off. I read it. "Liam has been coming into the office," she said, "more frequently over the last year. He doesn't have a formal role. Gerald gave him some kind of consulting title, I think for Vivian's sake, but he's been asking questions about accounts, vendor contracts, payroll structures." "What kind of questions?" "The kind you'd ask," she said slowly, "if you were trying to understand where money could move without being noticed." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I went back through things I had dismissed. The way Liam had started coming to every family dinner. The way he'd begun referring to the business as the family business, a phrase my father had never once used. The time, last Christmas, when I'd walked into the study and Liam was at my father's desk and had closed the laptop before I could see what was on the screen. I'd thought he was watching something embarrassing. I genuinely thought that. I called my father's accountant the next morning. His name was Doug, and he had been doing my father's books for 15 years. He was hesitant to talk to me at first. Client confidentiality, he said, which was fair. But when I explained what the doctor had said, when I used the phrase prolonged exposure, he got quiet in a way that told me he already had concerns of his own. "There have been some disbursements," he said carefully, "over the last 14 months that Gerald approved verbally, but I never received follow-up documentation for, small enough individually that they wouldn't trigger anything, but together." "How much?" I said. He told me. I had to sit down. It wasn't a catastrophic amount. It wasn't going to sink the company. But it was enough, dispersed across 6 vendor accounts that Ruth later confirmed did not correspond to any active suppliers, to tell a story. A careful, patient, long-term story about someone who had learned where to look and had been skimming, slowly, for over a year. There was more. The vendor accounts had been set up through a numbered company registered in Ontario. The numbered company's director was listed as a numbered holding, which is perfectly legal and completely opaque unless you know what to look for. Marcus, who worked in corporate law, knew what to look for. He drove to Mississauga that weekend. We sat at my kitchen table. I was staying at my father's house by then to be close to the hospital, with printed bank statements and a laptop and a pot of coffee that kept going cold. Marcus worked quietly and methodically, and I watched his face for tells because Marcus has a very controlled face that only shifts in specific, small ways when something surprises him. Around 11 at night, he looked up. "The holding company," he said. "The sole beneficial owner is listed as a trust. The trustee is Vivian." I heard the words. I understood them. But it took me a moment to feel them. "She knew," I said. "She's the registered trustee. She signed documents." I sat there in my father's kitchen, surrounded by his things, his old Bruges mug on the drying rack, his reading glasses on the counter, the schedule for his medication that Vivian had printed out and taped to the fridge in neat, color-coded rows, and I felt something settle into place that I had been trying not to see for months. The medication schedule. I looked at it. I'd looked at it 100 times and never really seen it. Digoxin, twice daily. I pulled out my phone and searched. Digoxin is a heart medication. It is used to treat certain cardiac conditions. It is also, if administered in doses above what is prescribed, not dramatically above, just quietly, consistently above, capable of producing symptoms that look, to the untrained eye, like natural cardiac decline in an older man: fatigue, weight loss, arrhythmia, prolonged exposure to elevated levels. I called the doctor at Trillium the next morning. I was careful. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I simply asked whether, given the phrase she had used, they had checked his digoxin levels specifically. There was a pause. "We've been reviewing his medication history," she said. And another pause. "I think you should come in." I didn't tell Vivian where I was going. I told her I had errands. The doctor told me that my father's digoxin levels had been, over a sustained period, approximately double the therapeutic dose. She told me that this was consistent with over-administration, giving him twice his prescribed amount, perhaps mixed into food or drink, perhaps replacing his pills with higher dosage ones. She told me that this could cause exactly what my father had been experiencing: a slow, medically plausible decline that would look, to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it, like a sick old man getting sicker. She had already reported it to the police. I walked out of that hospital into a grey April afternoon in Mississauga, and I stood in the parking lot and I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything for a few minutes actually, which frightened me a little. And then I felt it all at once: the grief and the rage and the specific, nauseating horror of knowing that someone had sat at my father's table and eaten his food and accepted his generosity and then methodically, quietly killed him. Because that was what they had done. They had killed him. It just took a year. I called Marcus. My voice was steadier than I expected. "The police know," I said. "I need you to send them everything we have. I want to tell you about something my father said to me 2 weeks before he died." He was having a better day. He had a few of those near the end. Days where he seemed almost like himself. We were sitting by the window in his room, and he was looking out at the parking lot like it was the most interesting view he'd ever seen. I asked him if there was anything he wanted to talk about. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I knew something was wrong. For a while now." I didn't say anything. I just waited. "I didn't want to believe it," he said. "And then, when I did believe it, I was afraid. If I said something too soon, I thought, well, Liam's not a reasonable person when he feels cornered, and Vivian would have warned him. I thought if I said something too soon, before there was proof, he might—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. I was trying to wait until I was sure. "Dad," I said. "I wrote things down," he said, "in a notebook, brown cover. It's in my workbench in the garage. I didn't want to leave it in the house. He squeezed my hand once. He looked out the window again. I should have called you sooner, he said. I'm sorry about that. He died on a Thursday in May, quietly, with me beside him. The notebook was in the workbench, exactly where he said. It contained 14 months of dates, dosages he had noticed, instances where Liam had handed him his medication when Vivian wasn't home, amounts that didn't match the pill count. My father, the practical man, the man who showed up on time and paid his taxes, had been keeping a log. He gave me the evidence. He just couldn't give it to me while he was alive without putting me in danger. I have never stopped thinking about what it cost him to stay quiet, to smile at the dinner table, to let them think they were winning, to protect me the only way he had left. The OPP arrested Liam on a Tuesday morning. Vivian was arrested the same afternoon. The charges included fraud, breach of trust, and criminal negligence causing death. The last one being, I was told, difficult to prove but worth pursuing. Marcus held my hand when the detective called me with the news. I didn't try then either. I think I was past the kind of crying that comes in waves and into the kind that just lives in you permanently, a permanent watermark on everything. The trial took 18 months. I'm not going to walk through all of it. The procedural parts are tedious, and the emotional parts are not things I can fully put into words even now. Ruth testified. Doug testified. The doctor from Trillium testified. Marcus sat behind me every day he could get away from work, and my aunt flew in from Calgary for the verdict. Liam's lawyer tried to argue that the medication discrepancies were the result of caregiver error, that Vivian had simply miscounted, that there was no intent. The notebook destroyed that argument. 14 months of specific dated handwritten entries from a man who hadn't told a soul. That's not something you explain away. Liam got 8 years. Vivian got 6, with the possibility of parole at halftime that I intend to contest every single time it comes up. When the verdict was read, Liam turned and looked at me from across the courtroom. I don't know what he expected to see. Satisfaction, maybe, or guilt. Some part of him always seemed to believe I had done something wrong by existing, by being Gerald's real daughter, by being the one who inherited a company I had earned nothing from, in his version of the story. I looked back at him. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. Then the bailiff took him out, and I never had to see him again. The house is mine now. I moved in properly last September. Marcus helped me repaint the living room. We argued for 2 weeks about the color and settled on a dark green that my father would have called too dark before admitting he actually liked it. The vegetable garden came back this spring. I didn't know what I was doing, really, but I found my father's notes from previous years in a folder in his desk, neat and dated, and I followed them. The garlic came up first, then the tomatoes, then the beans along the back fence, exactly where he always put them. Ruth still runs the operations. I took on a more formal role last year, and it turns out I'm reasonably good at the parts my father was good at. The relational stuff, the showing up on time, the not borrowing what you can't return. I think about him every day. I think about the version of this story where I called sooner, drove out more often, asked harder questions when he first said he was tired. I've made a kind of peace with that particular grief, or I'm working on it. Marcus is patient. He says, I'm not the one who did something wrong. I know that most of the time. The notebook is in my desk now. I don't open it often, but I keep it because it's the last thing my father wrote with his own hands, his careful, Scottish practical handwriting. The same handwriting that was on every birthday card I ever received from him, every note in my school lunches, every sticky reminder on the fridge when I was small. He kept records because he knew I would need them. Because even at the end, even when he was frightened and running out of time, he was still thinking about how to take care of me. That was who he was. That was who he always was. And no one, not Liam, not Vivian, not whatever they thought they were going to get away with, could take that from me. I keep the notebook in the top drawer of my father's old desk, not because I need to read it. I know what's in it. I've read every page more times than I can count. And each time I close it, I feel the same thing, a grief that doesn't go away, and underneath it, something that I can only describe as a kind of quiet respect for who my father was, even at the end. He knew what was happening to him, he was frightened, he was running out of time. And instead of panic, instead of lashing out, he sat down and he wrote things carefully in his neat handwriting because he understood that feelings alone don't protect people. Evidence does. That's the thing I carry with me now more than anything else from this whole ordeal. The people who hurt him were counting on emotion. They were counting on grief making me scattered, on loyalty making me slow, on the sheer discomfort of suspicion making me look away. They almost got that. I almost let them. What they didn't count on was that my father had spent 67 years building exactly the kind of mind that doesn't panic under pressure, and that he passed some of that to me. Liam and Vivian were not stupid people. That's the part that still sits uneasily with me sometimes on nights when I can't sleep and the house is quiet. They were patient. They were organized. They understood how to move money in ways that looked unremarkable on the surface. They understood that the most effective kind of harm is the kind that looks, from the outside, like natural cause. What they lacked, and this is what eventually undid them completely, was any real honesty about the world. They had built their entire plan on the assumption that no one who loved Gerald would look closely enough. They had mistaken grief for blindness. They had mistaken my father's kindness for weakness. And then they had made the same mistake about me. That's not a coincidence. That kind of moral failure tends to corrupt everything around it, including judgment. When you spend years taking what isn't yours, you start to believe the world is made of people who either take or get taken from. You lose the ability to imagine someone who would simply do the right thing because it's right. Ruth did the right thing. She had concerns for months before I called, and she raised them the moment I gave her the opening. Doug had sat with his discomfort, professionally bound, and when I gave him a reason to speak, he spoke. The doctor at Trillium reported her findings to the police before I even knew to ask. These were people who had built, over years, the habit of honesty. And when the moment came, that habit held. I think about that a lot now. The way character accumulates quietly long before you need it. My father kept that notebook, not because he knew it would become evidence in a criminal trial. He kept it because keeping accurate records was simply who he was. He'd done it his whole life. He couldn't stop doing it even when he was dying. I try to live like that now. Not dramatically, just accurately. Show up when I say I will. Keep records. Ask the harder question even when the easier one is right there. Trust the people who have earned it and watch carefully the ones who haven't. It sounds small. It isn't. The vegetable garden is doing well this year. The beans came up along the back fence, exactly where my father always put them, and standing there in the yard this past June, I felt something I hadn't expected, not sadness, exactly, but a kind of fullness, like he was still here in the most useful way a person can be, which is not in presence, but in example. He taught me what it looks like to hold yourself together when everything is trying to come apart. I'm still learning it. I think I'll be learning it for the rest of my life. That's enough for me.